Look, thanks, Andrew. My name is Matt Rees. I'm the Financial Management Specialist in PNG, and along with my counterpart, Ashish Narin, the Pacific Economist, we are leading the final sub-program of the 3-year SOE Reform Policy-Based Loan. Now, I have been based in PNG since 2013, but before joining ADB and the development world, I've spent a lot of time as a CFO and as an auditor. And some of the SOEs I'll talk about and we're working on now, I've actually had the pleasure of auditing at one time or another. And that's only to say that I do understand from various standpoints some of the challenges that are faced in this space. And look, right from the start, I'd like to say that SOE reform is a really challenging endeavour. And since I started on this program, I've met with a great many knowledgeable people who've shared their information and discussed various approaches of reform. I've also had many people offer their solutions freely, unsolicited. So there's a lot out there. And I think all that goes to show is there's so many different ideas and approaches and ways to do this. But I think we can all agree that well-managed, commercially run SOEs with strong, transparent governance are good for the economy, are good for the country and its people. So particularly in PNG, SOEs play a crucial role in delivering essential services across the nation. And what we've seen historically is that some have often weak management in place, leading to underperformance. And that means that not only are services not provided effectively, but that often SOEs can actually be a drain on the country's resources. So it's the PNG government's desire to strengthen those SOE systems and deliver on those essential services that was really the genesis of this SOE reform program and the policy-based loan that we now see. GOPNG approached ADB in 2019 with a loan request to address a budget gap and a desire to link those funds to an ambitious SOE reform roadmap. Now, policy-based loans linked to direct budget support, funding to government paid down on suites of policy reform actions over 3 sub-programs. Now, these PBLs, or policy-based loans, are certainly a different product for ADB and PNG for what we would traditionally see. We're known for hard infrastructure, roads, airports, hospitals, power generation. And whilst this does still make up the core of our lending in country, PBLs can be a very useful tool for governments to shape reform in sectors where they wish to align to their long-term strategy. Started in 2019, the reform covers 3 sub-programs, all linked to reform actions getting progressively more challenging throughout. This is a backloaded program of $500 million US over 3 years, with the final sub-program worth $250 million to be drawn down by the end of this year. Now, the reform has 3 main elements. At the macro level, dealing with legislation change, progressing into detailed governance reforms across the suite of SOEs, and finally at the micro level, enacting specific change within several individual SOEs. So, despite the many challenges we've faced in starting this program, notwithstanding COVID being the major, I would say this program has been largely effective. And that's only been possible with consistent support from the government. That's across Department of Treasury, Department of Planning, and of course the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprises. And obviously that includes KCH, the implementing agency for all these reform actions. We've also seen significant bilateral support from the governments of Australia and New Zealand, both supporting the program as well as the individual actions within it. And I must also recognise the support for individual actions from the Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative, PSDI, which is a lot easier to say. But they've provided detailed technical support throughout the program. And with that combined effort, what we've seen is significant legislation being passed that strengthen the framework within the SOEs, with which the SOEs operate. And this includes the KCH Act amendments, PPP Act amendments, and the Competition Policy Framework reworked. These amendments have allowed changes to the board appointment processes, ensuring greater accountability and better representation. This program has all driven increased compliance with financial and corporate reporting. And finally, at a micro level, the program has overseen effective recovery plans during the pandemic, review and implementation of procurement reform within specific SOEs, advancement of multiple commercial projects, and ongoing work addressing government arrears. Now, Zani mentioned $3 billion today, and so that gives me some comfort that the amount we're looking for is somewhat significantly less than that. And so broadly, we've seen all these actions have strengthened that framework. We've improved the governance processes, and we're looking to promote better performance, and we're in a position to do that within the entities. So what I'd like to focus on now is just 3 key pieces of this reform that I think would resonate with this room. And firstly, I think the changes in the governance represent really positive steps in increased accountability and transparency. And as an umbrella to all of this, I'd really like to highlight the important work that's been done in this space around gender inclusivity. Now, changes to the KCH Act have meant that at least one woman must be put forward on every shortlist for director positions. And we've seen that number of women increase from 4% when the program began to 13% now. Now, the professor isn't here, but I think Matthew can back me up, as Ian. It's a strong push from KCH to increase that number well beyond the 13%. Supporting this is also the creation of a database for potential female directors, being supported again by PSDI, as well as the New Zealand government in conjunction with the New Zealand Institute of Directors. Now, in addition to that, reporting through KCH, the annual report, as well as the corporate plans within the SOEs, includes gender reporting. So all of this creates a more diverse and stronger governance structure for the SOEs. And special appreciation goes to all the women who are putting their hands up to be on those boards as directors, the courage it takes to obviously what is somewhat a male-dominated place, but putting their hands up to do the work. So enhanced governance can also be seen within the KCH environment as they continue to drive and build their transformation office, bringing in specialist skills and know-how to help support the SOEs in their commercial strategy, direction, and bringing capability to large transactions. They're also giving input to the enhanced corporate plans produced by the SOEs, which include 3 and 5 year strategies, as well as capital budgeting. Now, of particular note to this group is the increased attention to financial reporting. And I think I can probably say now that we're on track to have all of 2021 financial statements across the SOEs final by the time ADB meets with our board in Q4. I want to make particular mention of the support from the Auditor General's Office, KCH, and the outsourced audit firms. To put this milestone in perspective, when we began this program, there were several SOEs that had outstanding financial statements as far back as 2016. And I think everyone in this room knows full well how important it is to have timely, reliable financial information, particularly if we're looking for potential investors and projects going forward. Again, accountability and transparency pays dividends. There's still work to be done in this financial management space, and we'll be working with other stakeholders along with KCH to provide that support as it's needed. Next, I think the ongoing work done around procurement reform is really important. ADB have engaged a technical expert who has overhauled the implementation of revised procurement processes within one pilot SOE, as well as working through the KCH systems, which are still for approval and implementation. But what we're seeing in this process is a more simplified procurement methodology. It's secure, it's fit for purpose, it's on an electronic platform, and it's driven by approved budgets and capital expenditure planned. The SOE benefits in efficiency, increasing the accuracy and speed of procurement, as well as defining the demand and ultimately helping to manage cash flow. This provides the supplier a clear process with quicker lead times to payment. Ultimately, a more transparent process promoting fairer competition. And with the success of this pilot, the work will be extended out to all remaining SOEs to be rolled out over the next 15 months. And finally, I'd like to highlight the amendments to the PPP Act passed in Parliament this year, which will pave the way for the establishment of the PPP Centre. The steering committee involving the State Solicitor, the Secretary for Department of Planning and the Secretary of Treasury have all met already for the first time and are scheduled to meet later this month to approve the budget and regulations for this centre. The centre will create a space for PPPs to be developed in PNG, and it will signal to the market that the government is encouraging private sector participation. PSDI, again, along with the Office of PPP and ADB, is providing substantial support to the centre, both in capacity and personnel, as they establish that capability in country. It will provide a clear and transparent process for PPPs to be transacted under and clear parameters to go to the market and allow the government to take advantage of open commercial bidding driven by clearly defined requests. So they're the points I wanted to touch on, and I realise I haven't moved my slides at all, which is really unfortunate. There's a snapshot of the funding and the sub-programs, women in business, governance and oversight, procurement reform, PPP Act. You know, I always like to include a nice slide from the travels up there just to remind everyone how beautiful PNG is. So, but as ADB looks to close out the final sub-program of this year and the focus shifts to what's next, we recognise that there's still a lot more to be done. And as Prime Minister Marape highlighted the importance of this reform going forward, we really look to build upon the momentum we have here on these reforms and promoting well-governed, commercially strong SOEs that encourage private sector involvement for the good of all stakeholders, and it's PNG. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Please come join us. Thank you very much, Matthew. That's a really helpful overview of what you've been doing in that project. Matthew, we might start with you, if you don't mind. Sure. Just as a question of philosophy, as far as state-owned enterprise is concerned, does the government and KCH that manages the enterprise have a philosophy about whether particular entities should be in permanently public hands, or is it reasonably agnostic about it? Does it have a guiding philosophy about whether these companies should remain in public hands? I guess that'd be the first question.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I think that the policy will always be reflective of the government's policy. I think the government has, past governments, and I think it's reflected in the view of the current government, are happy to look where appropriate at partial privatisation. But privatisation is not itself a means to an end. It's not necessarily a panacea for solving what might be seen as the capital issue, the capital constraints that many of our SOEs suffer from. I think it's also as important, if not more important, that any would-be partner can bring forward a point of difference in terms of contributing in a skill sense, in terms of being able to bring innovation and technology to the enterprise, and in doing so, relevantly be able to upskill the teams within those organisations. So I think it would be wrong to look at it coldly as a financial equation or a financial transaction. I think there's a lot more that's important in that exercise.
There has been perhaps a shift in the last few years about the purpose of KCH as the holding company. If we go back to the IPBC days, IPBC held major projects, management of major projects that were not handled by particular SOEs. Yeah. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Is the role of KCH more administrative now, or how do you see the role of KCH in helping state-owned enterprises perform?
Another hard question. I think...
Sorry, they're all hard.
I think only coming recently to the equation, my sense is that it's a more collaborative and partnering approach. I think in prior administrations, the lines have been blurred, and that may have been interpreted or misinterpreted as there being a contest from time to time between KCH and the implementing agency as to where a responsibility properly lies. I think it's clearly accepted, as I understand it, by KCH that the primacy of the implementing agencies, they have the sectoral expertise, data and a perspective. What KCH is doing at the moment, recognising that the government has an implementation imperative, is that we're trying to identify opportunities to assist and to work more collaboratively with the SOEs, particularly from the perspective of funding major projects. And in that context, recognising the great relationships that exist with the bilaterals and the multilateral agencies, we're actually trying to put in place some workable bridgeways in order to ensure that the time from project assessment to funding and project implementation is abridged.
Right. Ian, can I bring you up in... Matthew talked about capital, and I guess that's something that is a major challenge for a number of state-owned enterprises. Any Guinea's got to buy or lease planes in order to run its business. They're an enormous capital expenditure. PNG Power has enormous distribution network it needs to fund, and so on and so forth. What's your thought about how is the best way of supporting this kind of capital investment? Should it really be the job of the private sector to work with the state-owned enterprises, or should they be reliant, as they are largely at the moment, on either government largesse or concessional loans, which is the way that the current Treasurer has restructured things, shall we say? What's your own feeling about the best way of capitalising them?
Thank you, Andrew. Let me put it this way. First of all, we've got to understand and appreciate why SOEs exist in the first place. So they are enablers for government to deliver services to, the people, public and private sector. So, their existence is important. Secondly is, how have they been able to deliver that mandate? The delivery of affordable, reliable, consistent services, whether it be in aviation, whether it be in power, whether it be in telecommunications, banking and finances. So with that appreciation at the back of our minds, the next question is, has it been able to deliver that government's mandate? So we know that it hasn't, and hence the reforms that are happening at this point in time are very important. And Matthew highlighted the current programs that are in place that is backed by ADB. So first things, and I'll speak from as a representative from the business sector and also as an investor, aside from being sitting on the policy side. So SOEs have not been able to deliver the services that people expect from it, whether reliable, consistent, affordable services. SOEs have struggled with debt, so they don't have much leverage to do the things that they're supposed to do, whether reinvesting back into their business, investing in services. There's also the consideration of what is sustainable, so that they don't keep relying on government to inject or bail out. They've got to be sustaining themselves in a way that they can survive on their own. And then lastly, as a entity of government, they're required to pay back to the state. So be sustainable so that they can pay back through the form of dividends and so forth, so that government can then use that to plow into its national budget. So when you're talking about how do we keep SOEs going, and one means is to bring in private sector, for example, participation, that in itself then brings another discipline to the whole equation. And from an investor perspective, the questions that they'd be asking and considering is that what has the SOE got to offer that will give them a return of, a return on their investments, create a sustainable business model, continue to keep delivering the services that they support, whether it's telco or power. So that consistent delivery of services must be maintained. And then obviously, what can they do so that it's helping in the overall contribution to socio-economic development of the country? So coming back to your question, is there room for engagement of private sector in SOEs? Yes. And again, which ones would be attractive to private sector investment, for example? Aviation is the tough one. So there's a lot of learnings there. Telecommunication is probably an SOE activity that would be attractive or is attractive to private sector investment, as is power generation and water and ports. So yes, there would be opportunity for PPP or private sector investment. It now comes down to what is the specifics of the actual deal to be put together, so that one, it addresses return on investments. It's a sustainable business model from the lens of the government. It releases them from continuously coming in and bailing out SOEs. They've got to be financially sustainable, and then obviously in a position to repay government. Yeah. So, and there are some things that are happening at this point in time that are pushing in that direction. I'll also take this opportunity to just mention that there's been examples of successful PPP arrangements in the past, and we always talk about the banking sector and the move from PNG BC to BSP, and that's a good example of what can happen if there's a good deal put together that covers this PPP arrangement. Government will still benefit, will get its returns, but you have a business that's able to sustain itself going forward, paying back dividends to its shareholders, and providing, importantly, services to the people of PNG. So
that's an excellent example of a private sector involvement that's worked. I guess we could point to two others. One would be the way that PNG Ports as ICTSI is now running the major ports, the international ports in PNG, and that appears to be successful. Sometimes port users grumble about some of the increased costs, but generally, if you look at the improvement in the efficiencies of ports, it's demonstrably an improvement. Another one would be the use of independent power producers with PNG Power buying power.
Correct.
That's proved to be somewhat more problematic because there are complex agreements about the price of power and also people paying bills as well. So is there anything that you could observe about what makes a good PMP, so at a very in principle version? Either Matthew, if you wanted to jump in here, or either Matthew actually, what are the hallmarks of a good PPP in this space?
I think it needs to be a win-win.
Yeah.
It can't be disproportionate in terms of the commercial advantage which is gained, and I think that's as Ian mentioned when he was talking about some of the more challenging aspects about PPPs and IPPs, particularly in the context of PNG Power. There's a perception that some of the power purchase agreements that have been entered into with generators who have private sector generators are not balanced, and they're rather than continuing to drive us on the pathway, they may achieve the reliability objective, but in terms of cost and importantly affordability, they don't assist in that objective. So I think that's important to bear in mind.
Is there a list of priorities for which of the SOEs that needs the most support? For example, a lot of businesses, if you ask them, we ask businesses every year in our annual CEO survey, say power, and after that they say telecommunications. So are you conscious of having a priority list within KCH?
Yes, I think we are.
Yeah, I think power is a major pain spot for citizens, business houses, and just everyone. So ensuring that there is a consistent supply throughout the country. And yes, there's been some, there's, with the creation of New Power and Dirio and then supplied through PPA, but that in itself has not always delivered the solutions that is required. But that is one. Telecommunications is another, and that's another area that is being looked at with the view of improving, and obviously opportunity for a government to divest and then bring in private sector investors, so that the consistency, the reliability, and affordability is given. So that, in my view, are the two major.
The two major ones.
And then you put water probably as third. So you've got power, telecommunication, and water. Those are the things that are being looked at this point in time to push it along, so that it's able to do what its mandate is.
So to finish my questions, there may be some more questions from the floor before we finish, but Matthew Rees refers to the 3-year or the 3-step program that you're on. What follows that? What's next? What are the priorities once that program is complete?
I think a successor program in that I think that Ian's mentioned the current priorities. It's no secret that those priorities require funding, substantial funding.
Yes.
And it may well, optimally, we'd seek to move to a project-funded model going forward, given that a lot of the policy has now been addressed, and we think ably dealt with. We now need, I think, to get into a dialogue, which would see us being able to access the development or redevelopment capital that's necessary to address the priorities that Ian spoke to.
Ian, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I was just going to just add that, I'll put a question and answer it. Is there appetite? Is there appetite to get involved with SOEs, whether it be power or telecommunications or ports, or and yes, there is appetite, and I mentioned an example of something that is a model that has worked successfully in the banking and financial sector. So it comes back again to what presents a good transaction or a good deal. And I think overarching everything within the SOE space, if you get the governance right, then everything will fall into place. What do you mean by governance? And Matthew alluded to it in his presentation, is ensuring that you get all your financial statements up to date, having broader representation of gender in the decision-making policy. I think the state understanding that it is not the end-all be-all for all the solutions and the problems that are faced by SOE. So it's got to recognize that it can't keep taking a major position. So it's got to step back and take a lesser or a minority or a passive position, and then allow commercial decision-making to be made purely at that level. So those are the hallmarks to get a successful PPP going. What investors would be looking for is what's the posture of government? If they realize that government will provide policies that will make it attractive for them to come in, that's probably a first stick. The second thing is state to take a investor lens as opposed to a shareholder lens. So when you're taking an investor lens, you're saying this has got to work. If some tough decisions have to be made, then so be it. But if you take a shareholder posture, then all the burden comes back to the shareholder. So that's got to be understood, and I'm pleased to say that's actually in place at the moment, and that's what's underpinning these programs, that the current program that ADB is supporting. And then, of course, is the actual structure of the deal itself. The investor will look at, I'm going to put some capital in, what am I going to get out of it? So the governance there, it's important. And what's in the agreement, the shareholder agreement, how is that structured there? investors will look for a return on the funds they put in. So there's got to be a dividend policy. I think earlier on there was a comment made by my colleague Paul Sayers that there's got to be opportunity for divestment there and a time to exit. When does that happen? And are there enablers to do it? Are there other parties that are also within the economy that has the scale of money to be able to come in and either divest or inject further capital? So that checklist has got to be ticked off or taken into account. But I come back to the point, can it be done? Yes, it can be done. PNG BC to BSB is one example. A construction of the road from Hola over the freeway, that's another example of PPP. That was funded through a loan syndicate arrangement. Power, initially in Ramu, that was a syndicate of private sector financing. So there's examples of what has been done. It's what we do now, and then importantly, roll it out and have another PNG BC BSB story, for example. And I'm hoping that telecommunication or telecom will be the next one, that we can demonstrate that a PPP arrangement with the right partners can deliver the outcomes that government wants. It's affordable, reliable, consistent service, gets a return on its investment, and the constituents, the citizens, are able to enjoy the services that government is mandated to do.
Gentlemen, this is a very fascinating space, and I'm sure everyone in the room has a vested interest in the success of this project and in the success of KCH in helping to develop this further. And we look forward to updates in the future about how that process is going. But for the moment, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Please thank them.
Thank you.